Chapter 20. To the Land of His Ancestors. When daylight was sufficient, Two Trees wasted no time in setting off. He followed the chain of rock islands, going from one stepping stone to the next. When he reached Heart Island, Joe stopped paddling for a short while. It was here that Eagle Feather used to take him to catch crabs when he was a little boy. He remembered the delectable taste of those crabs when Small Doe cooked them for the evening meal. He paddled on, faster now, perhaps compelled by some unconscious thought that all the years had never really happened after all. Two Trees was coming home. He was on familiar ground once more. I don't know his names for the many islands, but I can almost feel his happiness as I visualize the route. Past the southeast end of Heart Island, he aimed for the little group of rocks now known as No Nation's Reef. Then on, and through one of the channels leading to the sluiceway that separates Hunter and Hog Islands. The looming bulk of Saxon stone evoked memories of fishing days spent with the father of his boyhood. The canoe moved on to the silent waters of protected Vagabond Bay. Slowly, slowly, Two Trees paddled along the weeded shore until he reached a tiny outcrop cloaked in groves of cedar. Here, he turned the bow toward a hidden lagoon and paddled into the tall bulrushes. He hid the boat among the thick rushes and walked to the main island. Here, Two Trees and Kane drank from the sparkling spring that started somewhere in the rocky depths of Hunter Island. The water was still as sweet and thirst-quenching as it had been years before. With their thirst well satisfied, the two set off toward the old hidden camp that had been home to one of them. The fallen leaves of winter carpeted the forest floor, softening it to their feet. Joe noticed the familiarity his feet had grown to feel at the slightest touch of any road was somehow different here. It no longer held the urgent insistence of the many years past. On these paths his feet felt satisfied, as if they had been walking over the miles to seek out this very island. He smiled at the possibility that all the years of wanderlust had only been some subtle voice gently calling him back here to the place of his beginning. As they approached, he could see the dense barricade of vines and brush was still intact. Many generations of Indian skill had made it what it was, undetectable and impenetrable. A few years of abandonment were not enough to undo all that. It wasn't yet time to enter the old home, though. First, he would kneel at the twin graves and speak long to Small Doe and Eagle Feather. It was right that they should know Two Trees, the son, had finally come home. He found the unmarked graves with an ease only one who dug them could possess. Time had covered them with the Maker's grass and shrubbery. This pleased the Indian. He spent a long time in silent communion with the spirits of those who gave him life. He tried to explain the empty place in his heart, which still grieved for them both, and, in a larger sense, for his lost race. He told them of his travels and the many wonders he had seen. He told of his moments of pride, and also those of shame. He explained that he had not, for many reasons, been able to make a place in the white man's world. Joe ended by telling them he was still Indian as they had made him, and so he would live and someday die here in the old places. Having told these things, he felt somehow better than before. In the saying and thinking of all this, his plan had been finalized. During all this, Kane had sat silently by his side, in some primitive way knowing this was an important ritual that must not be interrupted. He spoke gently to her now, and she rose to follow. He entered the compound through the hidden portico, which had apparently been unused for almost 8 years. Things were overgrown with weeds and creepers, but they were essentially as he had left them. The shelter was somewhat dilapidated, but that would be easily repaired. Even the stores of firewood were still stacked, ready for use. The foodstuffs he had stored away for that winter that he had never spent here had not gone to waste. Two Trees could see the unmistakable signs of many little visitors. Squirrels, rabbits, mice, skunks, foxes, all had eaten their share. But the wax-sealed pots with heavy rocks on top had not been opened. The Indian pulled the seals from some of these and peered inside. Enough seed had survived to assure a planting in the spring. Yes, he would know the taste of fresh corn, beans, squash, and other foods once again. That winter was not an easy one, but it was not as hard as some he had known. Joe cleared and cleaned the camp. He made it as comfortable as possible. The shoreline gave him many large clams, mussels, and oysters. The woods gave rabbits and squirrels for meat and fur. The snows came and went, and spring followed them. He planted and tended the garden, and by the next fall had vegetables again. The rich waters provided many fish for smoking. Within a few seasons, he had established anew the patterns of his youth. Occasionally, he would see white men along the shores. He became adept at the Indian camouflage tricks of old. I can testify that Joe could stand in a shadow and become one with it. More than once, I watched him seem to dematerialize before my eyes, only to laugh and appear behind me. He became expert at this hiding, and all that went with it to avoid any more contact with the whites who had hurt him so badly. A few times over the years he was forced to flee to the mainland woods as his father had. Now and then during that period, whites came, but they always went away again, and then Two Trees with his dog returned, for this was their home. As the years went by, the hair along Kane's muzzle started to grow gray. Joe's mind knew that she was now a very old dog, but his heart was not prepared to accept that fact. During all her life, Kane's love for him had never faltered, but toward the end, her body could no longer keep up with him. She wanted to go on the hunting trail with her master, but she needed to rest frequently now. An opaque film grew gradually across the brilliant eyes of her youth, and vision began to fail. The day came when she could not rise from her fireside spot to join him on the chase. Joe understood. He made her as comfortable as possible, and went alone to gather food for them. He brought rabbits, but she seemed unable to chew them. He examined her teeth and saw that many were loose or gone completely. The Indian cut her food in small pieces and hand-fed her. She licked him weakly in thanks. By careful feeding and nursing, Joe kept the blind Kane with him for another year. By then, what remained was a shadow of the once mighty giant she had been. The animal's pain was evident, and that night Joe prayed to Teachie-Manitou that she suffer no more. When he woke, the stillness of her body told him that she padded along happy trails now, in a place where he hoped to one day join her. He took her poor body in his arms, and thought back over the many years since a pair of yellow eyes had warned him away from the pups. How wonderful it was that this one pup had come to have those same eyes and had grown to love him for all the years since. For a moment he thought of walking to the city once more to find another dog. But even as he thought it, the idea was rejected. Among all the millions of dogs in the world, no other would ever be Kane. Two Trees buried his friend that morning in the road with his mother and father. He was sure they would care for her well in the afterworld as they awaited his arrival. There was a long period of silence. Only the few sounds of a winter night broke in utter quiet. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force this day's story into my brain. Please, please, I recall thinking, let me remember this for always. I had been allowed, by some quirk of time, to relive with Two Trees an epic adventure. He had told it in a classic fashion, giving great attention to the details that had made it live. All that remained now was for me not to forget it over the years ahead. Could I? I remember praying, as only a youngster can, that I be given a special strength to freeze each detail in my mind for always. I hoped that years to come would not tarnish this gleaming gift that had been given to a young white boy for safekeeping. The silence had gone on for such a long time. I nervously asked if there was more to the story. No, was the reply. He spoke again, though, and told me that after the burial of Kane, years had come and passed, one season leading into the next, and then he said, "But wait, there is more." He related how he had lived in peace and quiet on his island for many years. Here he touched his hair as if its silver would underline the years that had passed. "Then," said Joe, "a strange thing happened here." He went on to describe how his peace and solitude were broken. He noticed that someone came often to these woods and spent long periods of time watching the workings of the Maker. That person had been only a small nuisance at the start, but later had begun to examine Joe's rabbit traps. Since that scared off the game, the Indian had been forced to reveal himself to this white child. His original intention had been to prevail upon the child to leave the traps alone. Instead, he had decided to talk to the boy for a while. Then my friend took on a very formal attitude. He thanked me graciously for my patience in listening to the story of an old man. He said he knew I would forget some parts, but to tell it to my children some day, anyhow. I mustered all my abilities to look and sound offended that he could think I would forget. He only smiled and replied, "Tell it as well as you can. I will try to help you then, as well as I can." He told me to go home. He knew it was late and that my parents would be worried. "Here, you have done all that you could, and all that I could have asked of you. Now the time has come for you to return to your own world. My fate, those things to be, will happen here. Go now, with my respect." He had survived many perils during his long life. There had been cold, hunger, wild beasts, and even that unpredictable menace, man. But now I could plainly see he would soon succumb to a greater adversary than any of these. Time was the final factor for Two Trees. That hourglass, which held the sands of his existence, had run low. The last grains would shortly fall. It was obvious in the deep cough and glassy eyes of an ancient Indian. Now, thought I, is my time to act. I did as he asked and left. I made only a short goodbye, for I knew I would soon return. I didn't linger along the way as usual, reliving incidents that had happened here and there. This time I ran, a mission in my heart, along the paths and ways. I knew my father would understand the plight of a dying man and come with me to carry Joe to salvation. I knew that together we could bring him to my home. There we would help and nurse him, and he would live on. As with Indian summer, Great Spirit would stay the progress of his seasons for the last of a once mighty Algonquin clan. He would do this. I knew it. It was cold and cheerless, even though it was December 24th. I ran through the fields and shortcuts that would take me to my house. It was Christmas Eve, but I hadn't really thought about that all day. I remember it very clearly and want to emphasize that there can be no doubt about the fact that it was indeed the night before Christmas. As I passed the houses along my way, I saw families in windows, framed like pictures, trimming trees and wrapping gifts. There was the sound of joy from happy homes. I ran past a group who sang door to door of silence and peace. The Prince of Peace was to be born. Surely that was a wonderful sign. I decided he would certainly help Joe's Great Spirit. I remember thinking, as I rounded the corner toward my house on Stadium Avenue, that perhaps I had missed an idea here. Maybe the two spirits were really one in the last evaluation. I came up the block and saw the twin white birch trees that grew in front of my house. Their white stood chalky against the ink of a not-so-early evening. As I drew closer, I saw a figure near the front. It was my father. He noticed me, still at a good distance, and I saw him stoop to put something down. Then he started toward me. We met at the driveway. He started to speak, but my pent-up story cut him short. He told me to slow down and help him with what he had been doing. I went to the steps and saw that he had been about to hang our homemade wreath on the door. As we finished, he listened quietly to my request for help. He then said we would go inside and talk to my mother. When we got into the kitchen, my mother was ready to scold me for my lateness, but Dad waved her to silence and told her the basics of my story. She agreed that we might put a cot in the cellar by the furnace. She also felt it was our duty to do what we could. The decision was made. My father and I made up a rough stretcher, and my mother gathered spare blankets for the cot. At dawn, my father would come to help me carry Joe to our home. No youngster sleeps very well on the night before Christmas, but that night in 1924 was even more special. Other kids were listening secretly for sounds of Santa, but I wanted only the light of day. When the first gray tendrils of dawn had crept low in the eastern sky, I was already dressed and ready. My father had apparently heard me, because he was prepared soon after. We took the stretcher and walked out the front door. Snow had fallen during the night, and drifts reached up the steps. It wasn't too deep, though, and it had stopped already, so it didn't hamper our speed very much. As we neared the island, I watched for animal tracks along our path. I pointed these out to my father and identified the various species for him. He seemed pleased that I knew these things, or maybe, in retrospect, he was pleased at my pleasure in knowing. I showed him the trees and told him stories of ancient occurrences at various spots as we passed. The mood was a happy one. We would be near the Indians' camp soon, and we would accomplish our purpose. We reached the camp enclosure, and I could see by the undisturbed snow that Joe had not been outside yet. I showed my father the hidden entrance, and we went through. Something was wrong. The dead ashes of last night's fire were drifted over with snow, and no smoke rose from the hole in the shelter's roof. It was much too cold for Joe to be without fire. I ran to the shelter flap and looked inside. Joe wasn't there. Where could he be? There were no tracks in or outside the compound. That must mean he had gone out during the night before the snow started. If he had left while the snow was falling, I was sure I would have been able to spot the snowed-in depressions that his footprints would have left. I was nervous. He was in no way physically able to do much walking. What if the storm had caught him away from the camp, and he had fallen? Even now, he might be out there in the thick woods, dying of the cold. My father and I decided to separate and search the large island in opposite directions. I walked and called out all morning, and toward noon met my father again. He had seen nothing more than I had. We continued to search throughout the day, and when it was too dark to go on, my father made me come home. I knew he was right. What more could I do? But still, I felt I was deserting my friend. Early next morning, I was back on Hunter Island. I searched again until I finally knew I would not find Joe. I went back to his camp and examined everything for some possible clue. I could find nothing missing and no sign that Joe had taken any of his meager belongings. I kindled a small fire and made the familiar Indian tea for myself. Then I sat before that same fireplace we had shared so many times and thought. His words, spoken the last time we sat here, came to mind. My fate, those things to be, will happen here. That was his message for me, but I had not understood. I drank my tea and straightened things out so the place was as I had found it. Then I started slowly home. When I passed the thick pine grove at the crest of the island, I stopped and stood quietly in the heavy shadows. I recalled that Joe had sometimes gone here to listen for his father's voice in the sighing sounds of the wind. I listened silently for a very long time, and I never was sure if the wind voice told me or not, but I knew I would never see Joe Two Trees again. The sky was clear as I walked toward my family's home. Stars appeared very quickly when the winter sun faded from the sky. As it darkened further, I saw the broad path of light called the Milky Way. A new glow lit it, the campfire of an Algonquin brave on his way home. Somewhere a wigwam waited in a land of easy hunting, next to a similar shelter where a mother and father sat. I was very sure, however, that the wigwam was not quite vacant. In its entranceway, I could easily visualize two shining yellow eyes as they peered out hopefully, looking for the master. Afterthoughts. John Milton, the blind poet, said that a book is the blood of an idea, preserved and embalmed, to be handed up from age to age, throughout all time. I hope you have found this to be such a book. What is it that after all these pages is still missing? Everyone loves a story that has a happy ending. I haven't given you that in the story of Joe Two Trees. The picture of a human being voluntarily divorcing himself from all others and existing as a misanthrope for nearly 60 years is quite another ending. But is this the story's end? I sincerely hope not, for then this book will have been written in vain. If you, the reader, will take time to tell this story to your children, perhaps it will have a happy ending. In his telling, Two Trees asked no more of my father than that he remember and retell these exploits. In that way, believed Joe, he would never be completely gone from the trails and trees of his beloved land. When you go to the quiet places that still remain within our steel and stone city, it is just possible that you could meet him. I know you won't see him as a person, but the V of Canada geese obeying their ancient migratory imperative, or the furtive glance of a raccoon, the blaze of a gorgeous sunset, or one of these, or all, will be Joe. Don't lose him. When we allow the new to replace the old to such an extent, we will lose more than an ancient Indian story. Keep in mind that in our rush to meet the future, we must be sure to keep the past. Without its foundation, no structure stands for very long. As the Algonquin fell and was replaced in such a short time, so can we expect to fall unless we read a small lesson in the life that has passed.